So let's start. First of all, thanks guys for showing up. I think this is going to be fun. um, there's about a 15-second or so delay from when I'm talking to when you can hear me, and I think until things come up in the news feed or the chat box. Um, so just keep that in mind. We had a little delay between us. So, like I said, thanks so much. And this is the first one I've done. I'm planning on doing these every few months. So we'll see how this one goes. If you guys have any feedback about if the quality is poor, like let me know and we'll try to clear it up. I think I want to start first answering a couple of questions that I get all the time. I don't know if people watching want to know, probably, but I'll answer them and then I'll get to your guys. Just populate the chat box with questions and I'll try to answer them one at a time. So I've been asked many times, how is this being financed, this trip around the world? So there's a kind of a short answer, there's a little bit of a long answer. The short answer is it's through a mixture of airline points and savings. But the long answer is pretty interesting, and maybe it'll help you guys out. So my wife and I were traveling to Portland maybe a year and a half ago now, and I think we were staying at a couch surfing place out there, and there was a really nice couple that we spoke with, and they happened to be world travelers, and they said, hey, have you looked at doing the airline points thing? Because we were saying, yeah, we'd like to travel, but it's going to be really expensive. And long story short, they sat us down. They were like, look, you gotta open up the credit cards, pay the minimums, then close down the credit cards, blah blah blah. They worked us through the whole process, and we thought, okay, well, this is gonna be a really cool deal. So that's what we did. We paid down a bunch of a bunch of student loan debt with credit cards, and got almost 1 million airline points for just the fees on the credit card. So that's how we're doing almost all of our travel is airline points. And then we also have a little bit of savings, kind of for sad reasons. In the past, I don't know, 4 years or so, both my parents have died and Julia's father has died. And so we had a little bit of inheritance that we got from that, that we're drawing from if things aren't meeting. So that's kind of the way that we're able to do this. If anybody's interested, maybe I'll put a, well, it's called plastic.com, plastic.com, and you can pay down student loan debt with credit cards if you're interested in doing that. Just make sure you don't accumulate interest, otherwise it'll backfire on you. All right, so one more question that's kind of a two-part question about the interviews that I'm doing so far. Because I've spoken with people in person, and I say, "Oh, Steve, what's the craziest interview that you've had? Like, how are these people responding to your interviews?" I think that honestly, probably the craziest interview that I had in terms of the ideas was the conversation I had with a guy at Columbia about logical contradictions. And he was a super cool guy, and I liked him. I sent him my book. We got along really well. In fact, I was enjoying my conversation with him so much that I was this close to missing our flight from New York to Ireland. And like they were calling our names over the speaker. We were like running through the airport, which was a bad decision on my part, but we were having a fantastic conversation. But he was literally arguing for the existence of things like square circles and infinite sets, and I was just absolutely flabbergasted that this professor at Columbia was saying these ideas. Interestingly enough, probably the second most crazy conversation I've had came from a recent one I had in New Zealand about the same topic. This is the one where the professor invited me out to this huge mansion in New Zealand farmland, which was awesome. And he was really nice, and we got along really well. But yeah, I mean, he was arguing that in some circumstances you can have things that are true and false at the same time, which is just bonkers to me. But I feel like that's going to be a nice, like a friendly connection too. So there's something about and maybe I talk about this a little bit. There's something about abandoning the idea of intellectual consistency and allowing for logical contradictions that I think enables people to be really, really friendly. And I think it's probably because if there's no such thing as objective truth, you don't really have basis for significant disagreement. You can just say what you want to say. I'll just say what I want to say, and then we can be friends, and that's the end of the story. So those are probably some of the craziest conversations. I told this story once to a group of the Praxis crowd that I'm such a big fan of too. One of the coolest conversations, close to this one in New Zealand, was uh, the interview I did with Timothy Williamson in Oxford. And this was such a crazy experience. So apparently Timothy, I didn't know this at the time, apparently Timothy Williamson is kind of a well-known academic, arguably top of the field in terms of like logic and epistemology. And again, another really cool guy, super polite. We had a great conversation. And then afterwards, he invited me to have lunch with him. So we had lunch at Oxford, and like there was this like inner circle or inner city, I think it's called, in Oxford, where you're like not allowed to go. It's just for faculty and probably prestigious faculty. I think it was the oldest part of Oxford, and it was gorgeous. And we're there at Oxford, and we're getting all the food is catered. Everybody's like in vests, with their like hand towels, serving things to you on a platter. And I'm having this conversation with him about logic and infinity, of course, and about Zeno's paradoxes. And I just had a moment when I was there, like, this is an interesting. How did I end up here? Like, I'm at Oxford in this little inner sanctuary talking to this prestigious dude. I'm some guy on the internet, and there's people all around us, like, treating us as if we're royalty. It was ridiculous. It was awesome. It was a cool experience, and I really liked him, and in fact I agreed with a lot of his ideas. Um, but yeah, that was a pretty interesting experience. All right, so I'm going to go through the chat box and answer what I can, and then feel free to ask as many questions as you like, and I'll try to answer them. All right, so first question from Igor. You've spoken a lot about your love experience as something beyond physical reality. Supernatural phenomena have been related in the past and proven later as something explainable. Like, for example, people experiencing sleep paralysis thought they were seeing real demons. Why do you think that your experience is somewhat different? It's an excellent question. And you're not going to like my answer because it's not going to be persuasive. There is something about the unique nature of individual experiences that makes one distinct from the next. So the hearing of music, for example, is qualitatively different from the seeing of the color red. And seeing a demon in your sleep would be something that's qualitatively different from flying through the clouds or whatever. There's something about the love experience that is qualitatively different from seeing red or from hearing or from sensing in other ways that is going to be virtually impossible to describe without having the experience. I know that's not convincing, and my point is not to convince anybody of this. But if you try to imagine that you're talking to a blind person about the qualitative experience of sight, of what things look like, how they're located in space, and the person has had no experience of sight, and you're trying to describe, 2 and 3 dimensionality to them, and there's not a whole lot that you can say, if anything, that is going to be able to evoke in any reasonable way the experience of seeing to somebody who's never seen. And that is honestly what I can say about the love experience. If you've not experienced that, as I hadn't up until I was 21, and then I experienced it in a very profound way, there's no possible way I could have comprehended the nature of it. So In terms of spiritual phenomenon in general, like angels and demons, here's what I would say as well. That experience wasn't coupled with like tactile hallucinations. It wasn't like I was seeing entities or something like that. And that maybe this is because I've lacked the experience, but with those claims about things that have happened to people, I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical because it's very easy, very possible to imagine a literal like sensory hallucination that's going on. And the nature of that love experience wasn't sensory hallucination. It wasn't hearing things, it wasn't seeing things, it wasn't tasting things. The way that here's the way I'll describe it. You'll find it wholly uncompelling, I hope. Stay skeptical. If you haven't had this experience, think that I'm BSing you, that's fine. Just be open to the experience. It is as if I was in a way given knowledge about the experience that I was having. It's divine communication. And in a sense, that's the best way of putting it. As it is as if I was given knowledge that the experience I was having was of a different, required a expansion of my toolbox that I had not previously had. So it was something supernatural, something divine, something more precisely non-natural, unnatural. That's really the best I can come up with. Now, I get a lot of shit from people, and for good reason, when I talk about the love experience, because I have to say things like this, which is not going to persuade people. But I'm totally okay with that. It would be dishonest for me to hide the profundity of this experience just because I know people who are of a rational, skeptical disposition like I was aren't going to find it compelling. All right. Next question from Michael. The Columbia conversation you had, was that with the Jamesian Pragmatist? No. The Pragmatist was a guy from Atlanta, from Emory University in Atlanta. And that was that was a much more heated conversation. I don't think he and I will be friends, and I don't think he would entertain another conversation. I got lucky with that one though, because he was he's a rather prestigious dude. I didn't realize this in the pragmatist world, and I don't think, I mean, gosh, that was like episode 5 or something, 4 or 5, or really early on. So to his credit, he entertained this conversation with somebody that had no record at that time, and that is one of my favorite conversations because the ideas are so, from my perspective, so far out there. Yeah, and I'm planning on talking to more pragmatists, because it's just such a radically different worldview. But the guy at Columbia was, I don't know what his metaphysical position was, but his name was Justin Clark Doane, and the guy at Emory was John Stewart. All right, this one from David. I've read a couple of your articles about infinities and magic ellipses. You mentioned that an infinite set is a contradiction. What is your view on irrational numbers in general? Awesome question. In a nutshell, I make very big claims about the state of modern mathematics, and I love to talk about it. A great deal of modern mathematics, the way that it is communicated and some of the foundational presuppositions about metaphysics and about logic, I think are catastrophically flawed. However, a great deal can also be rescued just by changing our foundations, tweaking our foundations to make them solid, and then we can rescue a lot of the concepts, like in calculus, for example. I would say, you definitely don't have actual infinities in calculus. It may appear like you have actual infinities in calculus, and the reason calculus works is precisely because there aren't actual infinities. So you can rescue calculus no problem. So in regards to irrational numbers, it depends on what you mean by number. So here's what I'd say. Numbers are concepts in regards to quantity. Quantity by itself is something that is necessarily finite. A quantity is a discrete quantity. there are some ways of expressing quantity that are complete and totally satisfactory. There are some ways of trying to express quantity which are incomplete and unsatisfactory. Irrational numbers would be an example of that. So let me give you a case. Imagine the fraction 1 over 3, 1 divided by 3. Well, that I'm claiming is a perfectly precise concept. If you have 3 units of anything, you can meaningfully think of the quantity of 1 divided by 3. It is 1/3 of that. Okay. Now, what happens when we try to make that perfectly precise quantity represented by infinite decimal expansion? What I would say is you lose the precision. Almost by definition, it cannot be precise. So 0.33333 dot 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 and so on. That is not an actual discrete quantity for for an amount. Now, it works in the sense that it can be as precise, you can go as far out as you like, but as far out as you go, that is where the number ends. So if it's 0.33333 dot dot dot, you have 10 million threes. When you stop the calculation, and you can't just put the dots down, when you stop the enumeration of the number, that's what the number is, and it's necessarily going to be not quite exactly 1/3. So irrational numbers in general, you could say, like for example, let's take the square root of 2. What is the square root of 2? Well, it depends on how you ask the question. What I would say is it is not the case that there is a perfectly discrete quantity or amount that is the square root of 2. There is no such thing. In practice, what the square root of 2 is something like a concept generator. It is a formula whereby as you continue calculating throughout the formula, you are in the process of generating a new number. So this is both, I say this both for logical and metaphysical reasons, but the metaphysical is probably quicker to understand, that I believe numbers do not exist separate of our conception, therefore they only exist insofar as they've been calculated up until that point. So irrational numbers imply that somehow they exist separate of our conception. Okay. Looking through the questions here, does anybody have any more questions specifically? I'm happy to continue talking about mathematics. In fact, I will. Ask some more questions, I'll keep talking about math because I love to. Last night, my wife and I watched a video, which I highly recommend you guys see. In fact, it was, I don't know if it was a Patreon supporter, but it was somebody who likes my work. Let me know that this guy exists, and I'm a big fan of his now. There's a mathematician who teaches at the University of New South Wales. His name is Norman Waldberger, and I'm going to go talk to him next month. I'm super stoked to. And he is a finitist. He has very, very similar views that I do. And he had a debate with another mathematician who teaches in Sydney about the existence of infinity. And I'm not exaggerating when I say the existence of infinity is absolutely central to modern mathematics. Absolutely central. There's this thing, if you guys aren't familiar, there's this thing called the continuum, which is roughly what we think of as the number line. And it's where they think numbers kind of come from. So between 0 and 1, you supposedly have an actual infinite amount of real numbers. So 0.9999 and so on, and then 0.9987521 and so on. There's supposed to be an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1 on the continuum. This is central. This is where they get their real numbers. And in other ways, and in calculus and in set theory, infinity is everywhere. Actual infinity. So this conversation is with this guy, Norman Wildberger, who I'm a huge fan of, saying, actually, there are logical problems with infinity. First of all, we don't need it in mathematics. And second of all, if it has logical problems, we need to get rid of it. If whatever follows from the existence of an actual infinity is probably incorrect, and if we build our mathematics on an incorrect foundation, the whole thing is going to be screwed up. Anyway, it's probably a 40-minute debate between the two, and you got to go see it. It's fantastic. If you don't have 40 minutes, go to like the last maybe 10 minutes. And Norman gives an example of the supposed paradoxes, just the logical, oh, I guess this is what follows from what, paradoxes with actual infinities. And I'll try to remember it precisely, but don't take my word for it. You got to check out this video. Imagine that you have three piles. On this side, you have a pile of balls, an infinite pile of balls. Each one is numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. All of the positive numbers, all of the positive integers are in that pile of balls. In the second pile, you have a box. In the third pile, you have, well, you don't have anything yet. So this is our process. This is our algorithm that we're going to do. Imagine I take 10 balls from the pile of infinite balls, and I put them in this box. And then I reach into the box, I pull out a ball, and then I put it in the new pile. So then I go back, I take 10 balls, I put them in the box, I reach in, take out a ball, put it in the new pile. I keep doing that, I keep doing that, I keep doing that. Okay. Imagine, if you will, follow their logic, that this could be repeated an infinite number of times. So we go through all of the positive integers, all of the balls. Of course, I would say you can't do that, but act as if you could. The question is, after the end of the infinite process, how many balls do you have in the box, and how many balls do you have in that other pile? Well, in the other pile, you have an infinite number. There's an infinite number of balls here. But in the box, you have a discrete finite number. Let's say, this is the example he gives. Let's say you have 2 balls in the middle box. How is that possible? Well, one additional rule that in this algorithm, what we're doing is we pull out a ball that has, let's say, it starts with the number 3, and we put it over in that, and then we pull out we get the 10, put it in the box, and then we reach in and pull out the number 4 and put it in the pile, and then put it in the box, pull out the number 5, and so on. So every time we are picking a ball from the box, we are picking the next number in the sequence, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Oh, when did it die?
Okay, keep going.
It says offline. Uh-oh. You guys. Okay. Is it?
You're doing good.
It's back? Okay. Okay, so apparently I just lost the feed. So I don't exactly know where I was in that example. This is what the climax, it cut out. Okay. I don't want to redo the whole thing, but let me just finish that example because I don't know where it left out. So in this generation process, in this algorithm we're going through, we reach in and take a 3, and then we reach in and take a 4, we reach in and take a 5, and so on in this process. At the end of this infinite process, supposedly, there could be only 2 balls remaining in that middle box because we've taken out all of the balls from 3 higher after the infinite process. Now, that probably strikes you as ridiculous, because it is ridiculous, but this is actually one of the irrational conclusions that follow from the existence of infinite sets. So, so it's literally, you think, you're taking 10, and 1 ends up here, 9 ends up here, but after infinity, 2 ends up here, and infinity ends up over there. Now, don't take my word for it again. That seems outrageous, then hopefully that will pique your curiosity to want to go listen to more of these claims. And there's a ton of these supposed paradoxes. that you discover when you allow the existence of actual infinities. There's a ton of them, and Wildberger talks about them. So, yeah, Google Norman Wildberger if you want to have your mind blown of just how bad the state of modern mathematics is. All right, next question. Can you go into a little more of candid response to our conversation about consciousness and why you think the argument you were related is not related to the God argument? I understand you said it's because God is different, because God is out there and not something we experience. Can you argue for consciousness without the presupposition that other human beings around us are sentient? Thanks. Good question. Okay. So, so not everybody was probably saw that conversation. So let me try to encapsulate it in a nutshell. Well, let me take the second part of the question first. You can definitely argue for the existence of consciousness without presupposing that other human beings are conscious, and I'd say that is the case. The only thing that I can know about my consciousness, or about consciousness in general, is that I am experiencing it right now. I have a belief that, let's say, my wife is experiencing it, and you guys are experiencing it. You guys are having the same kind of internal experience phenomena that I am. But I can't be certain of it. So that I think is pretty straightforward. And even this is true with animals, right? We don't know, is a chameleon conscious? I mean, maybe. Is a dog conscious? Well, it certainly acts that way. I mean, if you have an animal, if you've been around a dog long enough, they sure seem to be conscious little creatures. So, but again, you can't know. Now, here's where it relates to God. So a lot of people argue that dualism is tantamount to the belief in God. That it's essentially saying, look, for magical reasons, there is some ineffable thing out there that you just have to accept on faith, and there's no rational argumentation. You're saying it's categorically different from anything else, but I'm just going to believe it. I'm just going to assert that that is the case, that it exists. So here's why it's different. What most people mean by God is a being separate from us, in the sense that we're not experiencing God all the time. It's supposed to be a being out there. And if that is our conception of God, we can't, it's a different type of argumentation. It's like if I were to say, I can't do that with any being, right? If I say, there is a being that has these properties out there, and you don't have direct experience of the being, but you have to believe it for such and such reasons. Let's say they talk about the infinite regress. They say, well, you have to believe it because there's got to be a first cause. I mean, okay, that's a line of argumentation, but it's a totally different argument to say consciousness is definitely happening. Consciousness is not something that's out there, and it's not something that we're theorizing as some entity in the universe, at least not some entity separate with myself. But I am directly experiencing. I have direct, perfect insight in the question of whether or not consciousness is a phenomena that's happening in the universe. So it's kind of it's a question that I already know the answer to, because in order for me to ask the question, I have to be experiencing consciousness. So I'd love to keep talking about consciousness, because it's been coming up a lot recently. One of the reasons that I think exploring foundations is so important is because occasionally you'll find that little beliefs in our worldview, really deep down, have these gigantic implications for how we live our lives, and what type of things we think were true. So with let's take the example of the self. Your conception of what you are might seem, just philosophy that's unimportant, but it has huge implications for how you live your life. If it's true what the mystics say, let's say, that the self is an illusion, that you actually aren't something distinct from other things, that means you are part of the universe. My goodness, I don't have this belief, but if that's true, that's going to affect how you interact with the world, because the world isn't something separate from you. If it's the case that, your conception of self is that you are just an animal with no consciousness, that you are essentially a complex system of billiard balls, that's probably also going to affect how you live your life. So consciousness is one of those areas where if you identify exactly what's going on, you become aware of the conscious experience, it can radically change your worldview. And in fact, it orients you in a kind of epistemological sense. That what you're trying to do with philosophy is not theorize about the external world as if it's the same thing as theorizing about the world. What you're trying to do is explain the phenomena that you're experiencing, the phenomena that you're consciously experiencing. So when you recognize that the internal conscious experience is the fundamental certain thing, the external physical, what we say is physical experience, has this speculative theorizing about it. It immediately, I think, puts you in a healthy philosophic state to say, okay, I'm not going to be persuaded by a theory of the external world that then turns around and says the internal doesn't exist. That's got to be wrong because we're not starting from the external and working to the internal. We're starting from what is certain, which is the internal, and then theorizing about the external. Okay, a couple more questions. David asks, beauty, is it objective or subjective? Objective meaning that you could say someone is wrong. It's beyond opinion. Okay, so is there such a thing as objective beauty? And if somebody says, that is not beautiful, and it's, something beautiful, and somebody could say, no, you are objectively wrong to say that's not beautiful. All right, so this is a really interesting question, and I'm very early on in my analyzing aesthetics. It's kind of on the back burner for me, but I do have a couple of beliefs on it. Here's what I'd say. Evaluation of beauty is something that is necessarily subjective. It is no different than evaluating the flavor of vanilla ice cream. It is a statement of personal preference. However, there is some kind of connection with objectivity in the following way. Beauty could be understood, doesn't have to be, but could be understood as has its intimate connection with structure. Structure has a connection with logic and mathematics. So when you're looking at a face, for example, if you have got a very asymmetrical face, you could say, in one sense, if this is your conception of beauty and what you're talking about, this is objectively asymmetrical. And it would be true if you're talking about, mathematical principles as objectively asymmetrical. Now, does that mean that your evaluation of the face has to be this is objectively beautiful or objectively ugly? That's where I would say, look, different strokes for different folks. If your evaluation process is tied to objective mathematical structure, then you're going to say asymmetry is not pretty when we're talking about faces. If it's the case that you think asymmetry is beautiful and like postmodern and avant-garde, then yeah, you're probably going to think it's attractive. The same thing is true with music. Psychological evaluations of songs is something that's subjective. Whether I like something is no different than the flavor of vanilla ice cream. If I like this music, I don't like this music. However, with music, it's very clear that it has this intimate connection with mathematics. There are some songs that are cacophonies in an objective sense. Their frequencies and harmonies are all mushed together. And there are some songs that are much more mathematically clean. And I do think that, at least for most healthy, normal human minds, most people will agree that a certain sounds crappy, and most people agree that a certain sound sounds nice. But again, I think that's just more of a quirk of how brains are structured rather than something being objectively beautiful. Okay. Michael says, I've still been either unable to grasp the idea and have difficulty being charitable to it. I think we're talking about what are we talking about? Okay, pragmatism. In a recent conversation between Sam Harris, who's a Darwinian realist, and Jordan Peterson, the pragmatist, two seemed unable to even get a foundation for truth. Peterson continued to conflate his idea of morality with truth. Admitting that a claim can be true, and admit that a claim can be true unless it A, grants some efficacy towards whatever purpose the claim is directed toward, and B, we know that the truth is the final truth, which he says is impossible because all truths are nested within a subjective framework, and it doesn't even seem like a pragmatist is capable of making progress. Right. Right. So what is my take on pragmatism? Uh, my take on pragmatism is that it is self-contradictory. I think that the idea, this is a bit what I talk about in Square One, although I don't use the term pragmatism. The idea that all truths are relative, more or less, they're nested in a web rather than being hierarchical. I think is self-contradictory. I think there are certainly absolute foundations for truth the way I would put it is they are inescapable. Um, about the laws of logic, for example, that a thing is the way that it is, and it isn't the way that it isn't, is a truth that is not relative to anything. In fact, all other truths presuppose that. So, um, an issue in pragmatism, in the metaphysics of pragmatism, there's this very confusing and at times seemingly contradictory idea about the existence of the external world. They'll say things like, there's no way to talk about things that are outside of our concepts. So, like when I was talking to Stuart about this, I was saying, like imagine some creature on the other side of the galaxy that nobody's ever conceived of. Does it still exist? And he said, well, you just conceived of it. And he was implying that, well, it's not existence outside your conception because you just conceived of it. I think that's a dead end. I think we can come up with concepts that nestled in the concept is this idea of separateness from our concept. And this is where the philosopher Berkeley, or Barclay, I think went wrong. He's got this great line, the idealist, subjective idealist, that to be is to be perceived. And he thought that literally nothing existed when it wasn't being perceived. And the reason that he thought things didn't pop out of existence in the world is because God was perceiving everything at once. I don't find that particularly compelling. But there seems to be some kind of connection with pragmatism there. So I think the pragmatists are wrong on many fronts. What I do like about pragmatism, apparently, is William James was, I think, correct to keep an open mind in regards to religious claims. So he's got this line that John Stewart said that I really liked. I hadn't heard before. I think it was something like, "My theory has to make room for your experience." I really like that. That's a rough paraphrasing. I think rationalists tend to stunt themselves in terms of how far they're willing to expand their worldview based on experience. So it is a phenomena that intellectuals have to explain as rationally as possible, that throughout history, a huge part of the population, probably the most people that have ever existed throughout history, these people report experiences similar to the one that I had about the unique nature of love, let's say. Um, One possible explanation for that is that we're all hallucinating, that human beings have been just purely hallucinating and making shit up, um, for thousands of years. And of course, that's true, I think, in a lot of ways. But I think a more accurate way to understand what's going on is that there is some part of the human experience that is very profound for those people that do experience it. And we need to not rule it out as delusion and nonsense offhand, especially if we haven't experienced it ourselves. This is where I think the kind of pragmatic open-mindedness is nice. Now, I will draw some lines in the sand where it is not the case that people can have transcendental experiences that are logically contradictory, as lots of people say. They say, oh, I was and I wasn't. And if you take that literally, I think that's a logical contradiction. It's certainly the case that any logically contradictory experiences are not actually logically contradictory experiences. There's something like experiences that cannot be coherently put into words, and when one tries to put them into words, one falls into an apparent contradiction. All we have to do is say, okay, well, let's not take it literally to resolve that. But I do think it's the case that there is something that humans can experience that changes their lives, and it needs a rational, open-minded explanation. And I'm kind of in a pickle here because for many years I thought, as most people do prior to the experience, that it was nonsense, that it was nothing different than seeing aliens or saying that they saw ghosts in a graveyard. Like I don't believe any of that. Until I had the experience. So that was a very humbling moment with the religious experience. So all right. So any more questions? Happy to answer them. And if I missed yours, just post it again, and I'll answer it. David asks, if I remember correctly, you mentioned in a Praxis Hangout that you could make an argument for Christianity. That was a major cliffhanger. Can you elaborate? I believe the question was if I could make an argument for theism. Yeah, I can certainly elaborate. Before I answer that question, I'll answer it as a principle. What you find in the world of ideas is that almost every belief system can become plausible and reasonable if you go far enough into foundations. The exceptions are those ideas that are logically contradictory and those worldviews that are built on logical contradictions. But I don't think it's the case that theism or atheism or almost any one of the religions is built on an actual logical contradiction. You could make a case that in Christianity, some treatments of the Trinity are built on a logical contradiction, and if that's the case, those ideas are necessarily wrong. But even something as radical as Mormonism, which if you guys research Mormonism, there's some crazy-ass ideas in Mormonism. If you try to investigate those beliefs and try to put yourself in the mindset of a Mormon and think, how could somebody believe these things as true? Don't ask the question in a mocking sense, how could somebody believe this is true? But literally, what are the things that would have to be true in order for somebody to believe that these things are true? Like when you die, you inherit a planet, or any of the other really remarkable claims in Mormonism. And this is the case with theism, that it's not a stretch of the imagination at all to think how some foundational things could be true that would lead towards theism. I'll make a really, really simplistic argument. So this part I actually have a positive belief in. It is not the case that given the phenomena of temporal progression, that you can have an infinite timeline in the past. In other words, space-time came into existence. There was a Big Bang. And it is not the case that there was any space-time prior to the Big Bang. You cannot have temporal progression along an infinite timeline. Okay. So I do have a positive belief that that's the case. So in some sense, you need a necessary cause. It doesn't get you to theism, but we'll get there just to half a step. You could see a line of argumentation that would say, okay, so there's a first cause, and part of the nature of that first cause is that is necessarily, by our definition of what we mean, the reason that we're positing it as a logical solving of the infinite regress, is that it would have to be non-spatial and non-temporal. Right? It can't be within the system because we're giving an explanation for the existence of the system. So now we've got a first cause that is non-spatial and non-temporal. And let's say that it is non-accidental. I don't think that's a stretch of the imagination to say, I mean, it's certainly possible that there's a mind that brought things into existence. Sure. There's no logical contradiction with that. If we look, we see a similar phenomenon all the time. If you think about it, a piece of art, or a piece of music, you could make a case that that thing was brought into existence by a mind. So why not everything? If art doesn't bring itself into existence, who's to say that the universe should bring itself into existence? Um, so it's not unreasonable to say maybe there's some rational first cause that is outside of space-time, and if there's some kind of creative force that brought things into existence, we're essentially talking about a mind. If we're talking about a mind that exists outside of space-time that brought things into existence, well, that's what people are calling God. And then here's the connection to any given theism. It doesn't have to be Christianity. It could be Judaism, Islam, Mormonism. If it's the case that there is a creative, rational, powerful, obviously, force that exists outside of space-time that brought everything into existence, well, it's also not unreasonable to ask, well, maybe it's the case, or it's not unreasonable to say, maybe it's the case that there's some kind of purpose for the creation. Just like when we create art, there's some intentionality behind it. Maybe it would make sense to say, well, maybe there's intentionality behind what we would call in that worldview creation. And if it is the case that we have this mind who intentionally created everything, that would include creating us. If we are intentionally created, then the question is, well, what is my part in this creation? If I am also created, maybe I have a purpose. If I have a purpose from the creator, well, of course, there's lots of examples, people throughout history saying, hey, this creator of the universe communicated to me and told me what my purpose is. So if you follow down that line of reasoning, if it's the case that there's a first cause, if it's the case that it is, it requires some kind of a mind as a non-coincidental first cause, then it's just a hop and a skip to any kind of theism. And there's some, in my own worldview, there's some strains of truth in that that I actually positively believe. Um, I'm still working through a lot of these ideas, but that's what I would say. And of course, you could do the exact same thing with atheism, because it is not the case that there is a first cause. And if that's the case, everything we're experiencing is fundamentally located in space-time um, through a chain of causality that is not broken. There's obviously no such thing as free will or anything like that. And we are just creatures. Um, yeah, that's not a stretch of the imagination. That one I won't go through because I think most people have a more default perspective of atheism. But yeah, I think that's a perfectly rational and reasonable worldview. And I'll say one more thing too. An excellent exercise to try to understand any claims, whether it's religious or not, is to put yourself in that mindset of trying to make sense of it. Desperately try to make sense of it. The most radical of claims, those crazy Islamic extremists, you can actually understand, right? If it is true that there is a God that demands submission, and it is true that when you die you get rewarded for your submission, it's not hard to see why some people are radical Islamic extremists, right? If you rejecting this idea of irrational, like fundamentally irrational action, I think is helpful to try to understand how those worldviews come together. All right. Any more questions? We'll give it another 5 minutes, unless we're in the middle of something good. Do also, if you're enjoying this, do send me an email or send me a Patreon message or something and say if you enjoy this, what you think you'd like tweaked or whatever, because like I said, I intend to be doing this a lot more. All right, Mike says, Square One was a starting foundation. Are there other subjects, maybe math, economics, rights, which you have considered similar starting foundations which you will be exploring in the future? What subjects interest you most, if so? Very good question. So I'll just tell you my game plan. For a while, I've had a game plan of writing about 5 books, give or take, short books like Square One, maybe a little bit longer, on different topics that I'm going to consider foundational. So the next book is going to be on metaphysics. It's going to be called The Mind and the World, and it's an explanation of what I consider to be the foundations of metaphysics, which is kind of like what we're talking about. I don't know if there'll be a case for dualism, but it will be a case against physicalism. Um, it will include things about how language works, because if you get how language works wrong, then that's one of these foundational errors. If you get metaphysical ideas in general wrong, it's one of those foundational errors. If you get how the mind works wrong, that's one of those foundational errors. So metaphysics is next, which will include language. Um, I'm not sure where this is going to be in the canon, but there will be a piece on mathematics, definitely. It might be the last one I write because it's such a huge topic and there's so much work that needs to be done in refounding mathematics on sound foundations. And I'm not exactly sure how deep I'm going to go. If that's going to be really elementary about why logical truths are true, or if it's going to be like going through Gödel's incompleteness theorems and infinite sets and explaining why calculus needs to be redone and everything. I'm not sure. Um, but that will be in there. There's going to be a book on politics, one short book on the fundamentals of politics and economics. And I put those together because I don't think you can have an accurate worldview, an accurate political worldview without understanding economics. So it's going to build on the ideas in Square One and the Mind of the World because it's going to be dealing with metaphysics. So your fundamental metaphysical conception of government, what is going to have huge implications on your political theory. And how is it the case that physical goods come into existence? It's a fundamental question. If you look around, right, we live in fantastic amounts of wealth by historical standards. How? If you get that wrong, it's going to be shot throughout your theory. So politics and economics are fundamental. And then there's going to be one on the basics of ethics and spirituality and religion. That's probably going to be the most controversial one, but I think there are foundational ideas um, which I would say are not as logically certain as the other ones, but I think provide a jumping point to explore those ideas. So those are kind of the main ones. Um, yeah, that's why I say those are kind of the main ones. Logic and epistemology, metaphysics, language and mathematics, politics and economics, and ethics/religion/spirituality. So that will take many years to write to put it all together. Once that's done, once that series is done, then I might either write one book putting it all together, like literally, or I might just put a belt around them and call it a series and be done. I'm not sure what'll happen after that, but I'm definitely going to be working pretty hard until I get all of those books done. Okay. Michael says, do you believe that a person might own themselves? How do you believe that we come to own ourselves in a Randian sense, rational awakening, or is there a different way? Such as how Kinsella suggests through a priori argumentation that these questions all culminate to morality or justification for owning people, particularly children. Yeah, great question. And again, this is one that's going to piss people off if they come from like the libertarian rationalist ethics background, because I'm not a Hobbesian. I'm not. Here's my beliefs. Ownership is a concept that is massively useful, that is utterly brilliant, and we can structure a society off of consistent application of the concept of ownership. Ownership is not objective in the sense that I don't believe in natural rights. But if we treat it as such, I think we can develop a very coherent and desirable theory based on the idea of natural rights as understood as kind of a concept. Ownership understood in a property sense. Ownership, when understood as you control a resource, then I think it's the case that there is some kind of objective control, like of my fingers, for example. Self-ownership is a kind of not as solid as something like self-control. Like, it is the case that I have control over my fingers. It is the case that I have control of my limbs. I don't think having physical control over something implies, I don't think it gets you to have objective ownership in the thing. So I know a lot of libertarians are very gung-ho about the idea of a priori argumentation leads to self-ownership because you have to own yourself in order to be able to argue. I don't buy it. What I'd say is that there's a first leap, like with the argumentation ethics. There's a leap that goes from um, it, we don't believe in the idea of objective, rational ownership rights to what their claim is there is inescapably objective ownership property rights. That first leap is the one that I object to. The things that follow, I think, are beautiful and wonderful and a desirable theory, but it's that first leap that I'm not a fan of. And there's a little bit of writing, like Bob Murphy and Rod Long have written a bit, I think, about some of the troubles with this idea of rationalist ownership. I'm going to write a lot more about it in the future. Yeah. All right. Last call for questions. This has been awesome, guys. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you guys have. Um, I know we have a little delay, so I'll give it about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then sign out. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for all of your support. I deeply appreciate it, and got a lot of really cool things coming down the pipeline. I know I say that a lot, but it's true. Sometimes a little bit overwhelming, but the next few months, well, the next year really, things are going to be consistently scaling up in terms of production. Going to have some awesome big interviews coming up. So stay tuned, and thanks.